If you're a SaaS software developer or a startup that's looking to scale or sell to enterprise customers, then this episode is for you. If you aren't working in the tech sector, then this episode is also for you. I'll tell you why in a minute. Hi, I'm Jane Singer, and thanks so much for joining me here today. As ever, it's wonderful to have you as part of our international community on A Seat at the Table, a community that includes fabulous people now from 94 countries. It's my pleasure to welcome Girish Redekar to A Seat at the Table today. Girish founded and exited RecruiterBox, a SaaS platform that helps HR departments manage recruitment applications. Girish shares not only a very candid view of what it takes to develop software that meets enterprise standards, but also key business insights that are applicable to any business. I love the fact that we get a real view from the trenches, along with business wisdom that's both practical and actionable. In this episode, you'll learn why trust is the number one criteria you need to meet when developing enterprise software, why you shouldn't try to meet every customer demand, how to choose the right SaaS software for your business, and the biggest lesson he learned along his entrepreneurial journey. Before we get started, if you want an easy-to-read, straightforward view of key shifts and developments in Asian supply chains without reading through endless amounts of bloated text and overly complicated graphs, if you're tired of wasting time trying to piece together the overwhelming amount of information online or in other reports, and you just want someone to make it simple, then the current situation is exactly what you're looking for. These concise roundups of key news and information help international sourcing execs get only the news you really need summarized so that you can reclaim your time and your inbox. For immediate access, go to thecurrentsituation.net. That's thecurrentsituation.net. There's also a link in the show notes. Now, let's sit down with Girish and find out about SaaS software. Girish, I am really excited to have you on the show and to hear about how you created RecruiterBox, but even more your experience in developing tremendously successful SaaS software in such a competitive market. So I'd love to just dive in, and perhaps you can tell us first what exactly RecruiterBox is, and then what was the service you provided, what prompted you to develop this product, and then we can take it further.
Yeah, sure. So, RecruiterBox, I think the official name of the space that we were in was an applicant tracking system. And I know that doesn't say much, so let me add some color to that. So imagine you're growing a company and you are hiring across the board, and you now need to keep track of all the open positions you have and collect applications for each of those and set up a process where you're going to say that, hey, this person's going to screen the resumes, and there's somebody else who's going to do the first telephonic call, and then someone else will do a technical interview, and all the way up to you make a hiring decision about somebody. So what RecruiterBox would really help you do is organize and track and maintain all of this information in one place, so that you have everything in one place. No candidate is actually falling through the cracks, and you know exactly what needs to be done as far as your hiring is concerned. So that is roughly what RecruiterBox would do.
So essentially what you're doing with RecruiterBox is you're enabling a company that's hiring many, many different people to keep all of that different applicant information organized in a system.
Yes, exactly. And you asked me about how did this whole thing begin, and what prompted us to do this. And I don't think it was like a very designed thing, in the sense that it happened very incidentally. And happens in many cases, this sort of germinated out of personal experience. So one of the previous jobs I had before I did RecruiterBox, college campuses. And I remember that we went to these campuses and we had a ton of applications from a bunch of students. We had this huge pile of just resumes, and we cleared out like a conference room, and we were 5 of us, and we just put it up there, and one of us opened like a spreadsheet, and we just distributed the pile amongst us, and we were basically going over this, doing the screening, and then somebody else had to take on the interviews, and so on and so forth. So we were all managing this in a pretty spreadsheet based manner. And I'll be honest, like it's not like the inspiration struck me at this point that, hey, we need to do something about this. We're doing our job, and this went about. And again, in my next job, which was actually with the Fortune 1000 company, and they were a lot more organized about everything that had happened. So it was a massive company. And it just so turned out that I got sucked into the hiring process there as well. The specific team that I was working with, we were about 3 people when I joined, and it grew to 80 people. So I just got naturally involved in some of the, and all of this happened in the span of a year. So I just naturally got involved in the hiring. And they had this big, expensive applicant tracking system where they insisted that all of us, we should track all the information related to hiring into this system. And we did end up having to use it simply because of the amount of hiring that we were doing. The thing is, everyone hated and dreaded using that piece of software. It was so clunky, it was so cumbersome that people just, we used to always find an excuse to just going back to using spreadsheets and shared drives. We always felt like this thing is just costing us a lot more trouble than it's worth. What happened really is that I got a perspective of this whole hiring thing from two ends. One where we didn't, really have a tool of any sort, and we were doing this manually. And the other end of the spectrum where we did have a tool who's supposed to solve this problem, but nobody really wanted to use it. When we were thinking about, I and my co-founder were thinking about things, this was one of those things that looked interesting. Honestly, we were very naive. We didn't know the business impact of this at the time. We thought this is interesting. And we said, yeah, why not? I mean, this is one of the things that we gave a shot to. Thankfully, it worked out. But honestly, I don't know if we did like a rational analysis of what this really involves and whether it's a real business or a real problem or not. It just stemmed out of a little bit of personal experience.
Yeah, I think that sounds interesting. And it's funny that you say that, because so often people get bogged down, right, by having these very heavy systems. So you bring in the technology to try to streamline things and make it easier. But when the platform is too complicated, you end up making it worse. And like you said, you want to go back, just please give me a spreadsheet. It'll be so much faster. So I completely understand what you mean with that. I think that one of the keys is really to be able to create the lightest possible solution that can tackle the job, right, without making it overly complicated for the users.
Yeah, that's exactly how it began.
So when you look at it, because you developed this, as you said, just to solve a problem you were facing, but it ended up something that you had grown to the point where large enterprises would be willing to use it. Can you talk a little bit about some of the obstacles that you had to overcome? What were some of the challenges? How did you tackle these things? I know it's not easy. It looks easy when you're a user, but actually behind the scenes, right, on the developer side, it can be crazy.
Well, that's a great question. When I think back at it, it floods my mind with a large number of things that we had to do in order to, make this work, especially when large enterprises were involved. And there is always a bunch of stuff around the work we had to do in product to make it a little bit more scalable. We had to add a bunch of new features. I think we had to rewire the way our, sales worked a little bit. We had to rethink the way our pricing ought to work. But if I really have to think about the thing that stood out the most to me, it's that enterprise sales at some level is a confidence game. What I mean there is that it's the most important thing that I learned from that experience is that, it's important to come across as a reliable and a formidable business partner for enterprises. And they are inherently extremely risk averse. So they're likely to pick something that's, dependable and boring than something that's exciting but unpredictable. So there's somebody's job on the line, and they're most likely to do something that's, that works as advertised. This is from the single fact you can sort of draw upon the reason enterprises behave the way they do, or the way they make their purchasing decisions. There's always like a committee involved. It's hard to sort of, get one person to make a decision. So it's like a group of people who typically make the decision, etc. So now, if you put this in the perspective of a software as a service business, right, then the specific thing that they worry about beyond features, etc., is about whether you're going to keep my data safe and secure.
Right. Yeah.
What happens in a software or a SaaS sale is precisely that if you're a software vendor and I'm a purchaser, and then my main concern is, hey, my data is on your servers, and are you taking care to keep this data safe and secure? And that ended up being like one of the largest problems that we had to solve as a company, about how to give that assurance and that confidence to our customers that, hey, these are the things that we do. We're not running like a cowboy thing here. We need to make sure we are doing the right things to actually keep your data safe and secure. And that was an ordeal. We had to, get ourselves some certifications in information security and so on and so forth. But I guess it all comes down from the point that, being good at enterprise sales is fundamentally about demonstrating that you are a reliable, formidable business partner who's not going to muck around with the confidence that you place in us. And I think we had to grow as an organization to be able to sort of get there.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. And when we look at software, we oftentimes think of it just in terms of functionality. What problem does it solve? What does it facilitate? And we really forget the critical aspect when you're dealing, like you said, with somebody else's data. It's a huge issue these days. Companies don't want to have their systems hacked, but also there's a lot of privacy regulations and so forth, and they keep increasing. So you're right, that's a huge thing to tackle. So you said that you got certifications. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So just for context, most of RecruiterBox's business was in North America. We had, I think, 80% or more of our customers were in the North American continent. And what that meant is that the most important certification we had to look at was this specific thing called SOC 2. And we had some customers in the US. So we also had to look at ISO 27001. And I know it sounds like an alphabet soup, but the important point is that these are some frameworks that are built by people who have actually sat down and thought a little bit about what a good security program ought to look like so that we are not reinventing the wheel every time. And the thing that really happens here is that they have about hundreds of what they call controls or requirements. And some of these things are related to what do you do with your servers? How do you grant access to them? Do you take care to make sure that you're backing up your servers and databases and so on and so forth, things that you would expect from a technology standpoint. But what was interesting that we learned over in the process is that there are a bunch of things there which is also related to, operational stuff like, hey, are you making sure that, when employees join your company, you're doing background checks, or, are you making sure that you have a process to revoke access for people when they leave your company, and things that would seem common sense, but it's good that somebody actually sat down and wrote a checklist for this so that, you can actually implement a good security program in your company. The thing that really happened, though, is we were a relatively small shop at the time, and taking on these compliances really meant that we had to keep aside some time and bandwidth, especially from the engineering team. And, we had to sort of reprioritize a bunch of things. And to be honest, we just said no to a bunch of things that we were supposed to do that quarter and in the next couple of quarters, and said that we'll do this instead. This is important. We spent a ton of time on this. We spent a ton of money on this. We hired like a consultant who helped us go through this process. But to be honest, I don't think it was a very pleasant experience. So we spent a lot of time, effort, a bunch of questions from other people in the company about, hey, is this really worth it? It just seems like a bunch of paper pushing and without much value to it. But yeah, so that's roughly what the compliance process looked like when we were doing RecruiterBox.
Right. Yeah. Compliance is never easy in any industry, and it just seems to be getting more complicated and more confusing as time goes by. I don't really know what the workaround is for that. I think most people who run businesses, regardless of what industry, are struggling with that same thing. Now, you talk about, of course, the compliance side of things, but beyond having that compliance, how else were you able to take what you did and sort of leapfrog ahead of so many other people? Because I'm sure there were many other people who were also trying to provide a SaaS platform for people in the HR space. What do you think you did differently?
I guess if I have to pinpoint one thing that I think we learned during the process is that we were not trying to please everybody. There are a bunch of other applicant tracking systems out there, and they're pretty good as much as they are my competition. I respect them for the fact that they built a good piece of software. I think the important decision that we made is that we decided about the kind of customer that RecruiterBox is best built for. And that really allowed us to focus in and make sure we're building the best product for them and ignore everybody else. And that is a sort of thing that you have to get extremely disciplined at. I'll admit that when we were starting out, and this was basically, we were happy to get just about anybody who wanted to use us. We sort of, were pulling the product and the business in the multiple directions. Like we got one large customer who would say that, hey, it's great if you would have this feature, and we would just run behind it. And I think this is kind of like if you see a soccer game, and this we would probably look, where all 11 people are just running behind wherever the ball goes. There are no positions, nothing like that. We're just all running that way. That's probably what a company would have looked like. And I think what we got smarter about over time is to pick and say that, hey, this is a customer that we really care about. This is where we are going to actually solve their problems. This makes sense for us, and ignore advice and feedback and anything else that you need to do about the other segments. And that was, while at the face of it, it sounds fairly constraining, but it was immensely liberating to us as a company, because it sort of freed us from knowing or worrying about a bunch of other things, and sort of have these blinders on where we could really, really focus and make those customers happy. I think our eventual strength was able to do this to a fair degree of success. And if I had to pick one thing, this would probably be it.
That is such a good point, and I'm really glad you brought that up, because I struggle with that too. And you're right, it takes a huge amount of discipline to not get distracted, to not see so many different things that you could do and say, well, I could do this, I could do that. Why don't we add this? Why don't we try to put that feature on? You become what they call, right, a feature creature, developing way too many things and not becoming an expert at anything.
Yeah.
So, all right, if we're looking at what you did specifically, and I think that what you were saying about being focused is so important. If you were talking to a client, right, if you were advising somebody who was looking to buy SaaS software for their company, and it might not necessarily be yours, but just in general, let's say a friend, right, or a family member, and they were looking to purchase it, and they said, hey, Girish, you have expertise in this. I'm looking at all these different systems. What should I be looking for? How do I evaluate? There's so many, with each one has different features. Some have the same features, but a lot of them have different things. Some have a lot more features, some have fewer features. What would you, as someone who's developed very successful software, what would you tell them they need to do? What's the criteria?
That's a great that's a great question. I honestly don't know if I have an answer to that. I struggle with this myself when I'm picking software that we need for growing our company. I don't think I have it down yet to something that I could actually shell out as advice. But the couple of guidelines that I use for myself, there is a ton of software out there, like you said, and they all are so feature rich, and they all have these bells and whistles. It really becomes hard to decide how to do this. I think the one guiding principle that's probably helped me a little bit more is to think a little bit from the perspective of the outcome that you would actually want to get as a result of using this software. And I know it sounds too simplistic, but I've often found myself getting lost so much in terms of the features and everything else that I sort of lose track of the fact that, hey, what is it that I'm exactly trying to achieve from this?
Yeah.
And usually it's best to think about what you want to achieve outside of thinking in terms of tools. Like there is a business outcome that you're trying to achieve, and it's good to write that down actually. So this is one of the things that I do today when I'm trying to evaluate something like that. I just write down what is it that I would like, what is my world going to be like if using this tool were successful, without thinking about the tool itself. And so this is basically the destination I need to get at. And then I try and become a little bit more laser focused about the tool that gets me closest to it, and the things that I detest about the way the process works today about this, and the tool that can sort of, to take them out. It's funny that just framing the problem this way suddenly means that I don't get as tempted by the shiny new feature that the tools are talking about, because, hey, great, it's great that you built this, but it's not really relevant to me and to getting me to the goal. And it just, everything becomes a little bit more simpler for me. So I guess, my simple advice to people who are doing this is to write down the outcome you're looking for. And then it sort of helps you make this a little bit easier.
That's such great advice. And I 100% agree. It's so easy to get distracted by all the cool things that a lot of the developers put on there. And like you said, if they don't actually serve a purpose in your business, they tend to be more of a burden. They tend to distract you, or they bog down the operating of that particular software. So I think that's absolutely great advice. If we're looking at your journey in this process of developing SaaS software meets enterprise standards and all that, what would you say that you learned that surprised you? We're going to take a quick break now, and then we'll be right back.
We were hiring when we were making 50 to 100K monthly losses.
And why? Welcome to episode 1.
I can't think of a single founder who's been around for a decent amount of time in business who hasn't had their tunnel of year. This was that year. We're going to be okay, yeah, Sheree. Some are going to hear this and think, you TDP. But hear me out. You only have to do the math to understand that very soon we were $500,000 down.
Mm-hmm. That's basically that's a great question. So, as soon as you say that, there's like a flood of things that come to my head, and I'm not sure I remember many of those things, because honestly, many things that were surprising and wonderful to think about at the time became obvious in the hindsight.
Right.
So if I have to really pick something, it's that I guess what I was most surprised was by, the bunch of things that I learned about myself that I previously did not know. In some way, running a startup is a deeply personal journey. Right. And like, to just give you an example, right? I used to think that I never imagined myself as someone who's going to run a business. And I used to think that running a business isn't for me. I've been trained as an engineer. I'm educated as an engineer, and I enjoy building things, but I never inherently thought of building a business or thinking of business as something that requires building. And when this was happening, and this happened not as a point in time, but gradually over the years that we started and built out RecruiterBox. And I guess I never really thought of it that way before. And now it's a little bit more natural for me to think about it like that. But if you had asked this to me before I did RecruiterBox, then business just seemed like this thing that people do and they innately good at. And it involves, I don't know, like I build a business. This is often about building teams and organizations and other kind of systems which are not necessarily, with atoms or bits. I used to think that running a business isn't exactly for me. This seemed like an alien thing that I don't know anything about. What I guess I learned in the process is that there are many parallels between the way you solve an engineering problem and the way you solve a business problem. You break it down, you sort of look at something specifically, and then you can actually go about solving the smaller bits, which is a lot easier than staring at a mountain of things that you want to solve, etc. What I guess is the most, and this didn't happen over a day. This is not like at a point in time. It struck me as an enlightening thing. But I guess what has really happened to me internally is that I transformed from thinking about engineering problems as very different than business problems. And like, both require building, both require troubleshooting. Both of them have many elements which have many parallels in them. And it doesn't sort of feel like you're mixing oil and water as much as it used to in my head earlier,
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And it's an interesting way to frame it, because so often people don't look at business management as, especially if it's a startup or something like that. Of course, at an enterprise level, people realize that you're running a very complex operation. On a startup level, people just sort of think, oh, you just, sell some things and manage your bills and all this kind of thing. People don't realize that actually you have to have a different way of looking at things. You have to approach it from a different mindset and with a different even skill set. So I think that's great that you brought that up. When you're looking at what you've built, what would you feel is the most valuable lesson that you've learned through this journey?
Those kind of questions are always, hard to answer about picking one thing. I'll give it a shot nonetheless.
Okay, you can say more than one thing if you want.
That helps. But the one thing that immediately entered my mind as soon as you popped that question is there's this thing that I think a guy called Sam Altman said, which is that the days are long, but the years are short.
Right.
And he's also talking about it in the context of a startup. And I that really struck me because it sort of tells me that, time is an extremely limited resource. It goes by fast. And it's very easy, especially in a startup where you're always running behind something, you're always hustling behind something, to get lost in the day-to-day transactional stuff. And you feel very busy and productive. But, fairly soon, months and years pass by, and you realize you haven't really gotten anywhere. So, I guess the most valuable lesson for me, and I don't think I've gotten good at this as yet, but something that I try to be conscious about is to pick the things that you work on and to say no to everything else. There's probably a thread about this in what I was saying earlier, but what I guess I've learned is that it's important to make conscious choices rather than just reacting to what's been thrown at you, and that usually means saying no to a bunch of things that look interesting and that you would otherwise do. But I would even go as far as saying the controversial statement that it's more important to pick something than to pick the right thing. Because at least when you pick the wrong thing, you give it a certain amount of time and then you realize that, okay, this is not working out. And then you move on to the next thing that you got to pick. But it's more important to pick rather than pick the right thing. And I guess that would probably be the largest difference that's happened to me as compared to like the person I was about 10 years ago, where I just go after things that it seemed most interesting to me at the time. Yeah. You can call that being focused or I don't know how to call it, but unless you do that, what's really going to happen is that I realize that at least for me, what really ends up happening is that I feel like I'm doing a ton of work, but
yeah, so I think that's a really interesting point, because you're right. So many of us, me too, feel overwhelmed. And yet a lot of it is stuff like, why are we working on this? Do you know what I mean? So I think that's a really important point to bring up and to say to people, like you're saying, is that you learn that you have to really focus on those things that matter and go deep on those, as opposed to sort of diluting your time and attention over too many different things.
Yeah.
I know you said that you've sold RecruiterBox, that you were able to take this from launch all the way through to exit. Congratulations. That's not an easy thing to do. What are you doing now? Can you tell us a little bit about what you're working on now?
Yeah, absolutely. Would love to. So the short answer is I'm back in the saddle now. After exiting RecruiterBox, we took about a year's break, and my co-founder and I were looking at what we should build next. And fundamentally, what we picked is, again, a problem that we had faced personally before. So if you remember, I was talking about how hard it was for us to become compliant. And that's one of the experiences that has sort of stayed with us. And we've always wondered, does it really have to be that hard? Now the other technology B2B companies become compliant with these things like SOC 2, ISO 27001, GDPR, HIPAA, etc. The way this works is that we help you get there with 1/10 the effort, because Sprinto helps you automate a bunch of things that you would otherwise have to do manually. And that really, really helps, because what that really amounts to is that you're not going to be cannibalizing any of your engineering bandwidth while you're doing these compliances. And what it really helps you do, or the outcome it really helps you achieve, is that you're more likely to close these large high ticket enterprise deals. You're going to shorten your sales cycle, so you're not spending a ton of time in the back and forth that happens in the security reviews, and you actually fly through your your vendor due diligence very easily. So it sounds like it's a compliance and a security thing, but I think the real outcome it really brings for our customers is that it actually helps you amplify your revenue. So I'm pretty excited about it. We hear good things from our customers who were really happy about the fact that they were able to actually close that deal that was blocked on this. So yeah, that's what we do today.
Oh, I think that's huge. And I really love the way you've taken each experience in your career and then parlayed it into the next thing, right? You took your experience trying to manage recruitment, and then you ended up building that recruitment app that was easier to use. And then you went on to say, well, one of the hardest things that we had to tackle when we were building that recruitment app and trying to get enterprise customers to use it was figuring out all the compliance stuff and doing that. So now we've gone on to build an app to help simplify that. So yeah, I think that's excellent. It's very exciting to hear what you've done. Girish, where can people connect with you? Where can they find you? And where can they learn more about Sprinto?
So Sprinto is at, sprinto.com. We are sprinto.com. So just head over there. You'll get a ton of information about what we do. I'm personally available at girish@sprinto.com. So feel free to drop me a line if there's anything that I could help you with. It doesn't have to be what we do at Sprinto. If you have any questions about compliances itself or how to go about your enterprise sales, happy to share my notes. Happy to help in any way I can. If you're a budding entrepreneur yourself, happy to chat with you as well. So just feel free to drop a line.
Oh, that's wonderful. Well, it has been fabulous talking to you, Girish. I really appreciate your time. I've learned a tremendous amount. What you've shared is so many great insights, not only about developing SaaS software, but also really practical things about how to manage your business. So thank you so much.
Thanks for having me, Jane. I really enjoyed this as well.
If you enjoyed this podcast, be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform so you never miss an episode. And if you're feeling overwhelmed by the amount of industry information being dumped onto your desk or into your inbox, then take a look at the current situation, where supply chain execs get only the news they really need, summarized so that they can reclaim their time and their inboxes. You can learn more at thecurrentsituation.net. That's thecurrentsituation.net. Before you go, don't forget to check the Seat at the Table's website. You'll find all of the previous podcast episodes, other useful information, as well as how to contact us. You can find it at seatpodcast.net or in the show notes. That's all for now. I'm Jane Singer, and I'll see you in the next podcast episode.